He learned the kitchen by touch long before he learned it by name. In the dark between late service and the first deliveries, Mateo moved like a body that had become a map of a place. Left at the grease trap, right at the mop sink, a pivot at the dishwashing station where the fluorescent light hummed and made halos of steam. Plates made a language he understood, the dull clack of a ramekin, the ringing note when a wine glass met glass, the way ceramic cooled and settled. He understood how long a pan could sit under water. Before the grease hardened into a crust, he had to scrape with a patience he had practiced for years. He kept a small photograph folded against his heart in his wallet. It was the size of a credit card, his daughter's face, the crooked smile of a boy whose front tooth still had the baby gap. Two parents on either side, hands resting on shoulders as if to brace her. Sometimes, when the night shift quieted and the ovens clicked off, Mateo would press the picture to his palm and let the steam fog the edges. He had arrived here from another country with a single suitcase and the steady belief that the work he did, with wet hands and calloused thumbs, was honest. He had also come with a modest map of a future, a small storefront 2 blocks from the kitchens, a coffee machine with a dented portafilter where night workers could come in, warm empanadas on the counter, a bulletin board for phone numbers and notices, and in the corner, a jar that said, "Tips for when times are thin." He kept that dream in a notebook with a torn cardboard cover. He wrote numbers in it, prices of espresso machines, and the names of suppliers. He also kept it near the page where he'd sketched the layout, because a plan needs a place to live before it can become a business. Nobody noticed Mateo most nights. He was the kind of person who could empty a tray of plates without anyone asking, who pushed the heavy cart in a path that cleared the cook's way and left no evidence he had been there. Servers called his name when they needed something, and then apologized for interrupting, as if his role was an inconvenience between them and the work they were paid to do. He learned to move small, to occupy the corners of other people's steps. It gave him a strange kind of freedom. When you are invisible, the world sometimes confesses its small truth-telling things to you. The confession came in the measurements of paper and ink. He noticed it because he counted what others tossed away. Mateo sorted through the shift's remains with a collector's respect. Napkins with notes, order pads smeared with sauce, a ledger someone had tucked into the back of a supply cabinet. He developed an eye for patterns in paper, how a series of similar receipts might mean a server pocketing cash for themselves, how a missing envelope could mean the tips jar was being skimmed. Paper was where the kitchen hid its messes. Mateo made it his job to make them neat.
On a Thursday, when the rain had thinned the crowd to a patient, slow trickle, and the fluorescent lights cast a blue pallor over everything, he found the ledger. It was tucked behind a stack of boxed aprons, the kind that slipped off a hook when you reached for them. The book had been an afterthought until his fingers brushed the spine and felt the weight of more than orders. A small envelope, the edges damp with the steam, slipped between pages as if someone had hurriedly hid it. Mateo's thumb caught the flap. The name on the tab was itchy and uneven, handwritten, not typed. The amount listed on the page next to it did not match what had been counted at the close of the night. Mateo's first impulse was practical. He would return the ledger to the manager's office in the morning, quietly. He would not brandish it. He had rules. He had been told by older co-workers to mind his stations. "Keep your head down," the line cook had said. And the words landed like instructions you accept because you must keep a job. But that night, when he took the ledger to the register to slide it back into place, he caught a movement across the kitchen, a hand slipping into a jacket, the soft clink of metal against fabric. The manager, Luis, was a careful man in public. He kept a clipboard like an armor and a smile that folded into a polite firmness. But there, under the shadow of the storage rack, Luis's hand closed around an envelope and tucked it into his pocket the way a waiter tucks a receipt into his waistband. A photograph is an economy of choices. Mateo had his phone folded like a talisman in his back pocket. He almost always kept it there, quiet and low. He thought he would remember the moment, how the hand moved, the shape of the envelope, the ledger's trees, but memory softens with simple routine. He made the decision in the 2 seconds between watching and letting the world proceed. He pulled the device out. He raised it in a way that looked like he was looking for a message, like he was checking his watch. The lens found the pocket, the linen cuff, the envelope's white flap disappearing into fabric. The shutter clicked, soft, almost apologetic. He did not post the photo. He did not send it as a message to anyone. He folded it into the private part of his life, the same place where the family photograph lived. He showed it to no one. He saved it because his life had taught him that some truths are better kept as records than as accusations. He'd seen how rumors could become weapons or how a spoken complaint could be turned into the sort of trouble that eats wage hours and leaves a notice taped to a locker. A photograph in his hands was a ledger of another kind, a small, hard thing you could hold up to the light. For a week, the picture slept in his phone. He lived with it like someone living with a secret dish under a pot. The smell on the air changes you subtly, and you catch yourself tapping the rim of it more often than you mean to.
He found himself watching Luis in the way you watch a sound you suspect is about to shift into a word you don't know. He noticed the way the manager kept the tip jar a little farther from the cash register, as if distance alone might safeguard a practice. He noticed small reimbursements that showed up on payroll as MISC, tiny, frequent, and always just below the ledger line where auditors might look. He noticed employees quieter at the end of the night, counting tips with the furtive calculation of people unsure if what they had belonged in totals. There were nights Mateo considered nothing, simply an intrusion that would pass. There were nights he considered telling a trusted cook, Rosa, who had worked there longer and who kept a list of complaints folded into her apron. But he feared the ripple. A complaint begins as a stone you throw into a pond. The ripples touch people who are not ready to feel the cold. Rosa could lose the hours she needed to make rent. A young dishwasher fresh in the role could find himself locked out from shifts. Mateo knew the calculus of silence in a way that made his hands clench. He also knew a larger calculus, the steady subtraction of small things from many paychecks, the hush that made it harder to ask for better scheduling or to bring up a broken hood vent. He thought of his daughter's school fees and the dentist appointment he had promised to cover. He thought of the small plan for his cafe and how even a minor pay cut would mean a postponed machine purchase. The photograph sat like a small counterweight in his pocket, proof and temptation in equal measure. The first time anyone noticed anything was not the manager. It was Anna, a midday server with a laugh like glass, who stopped by the sink to press a dish towel to her brow and asked about his daughter. He handed her the small photograph without thinking, the way you offer someone a recipe because you think they will appreciate the simplicity of it. Anna smiled at the picture, then at Mateo. "You should open that cafe," she said. "We need places like that." When Mateo finally showed the photograph to Rosa, he did it under the hum of the walk-in cooler, both of them wrapped in the gray air where the spices hung like dust motes. He did not show her the face of the manager. He showed her the ledger and the pocketed envelope. The photo, in the glow of the cooler's light, looked mundane and therefore undeniable. Rosa kept silence for a long time. She had a quiet way of listening that collected facts like a sieve. "People here are tired, Mateo," she said. "We get tired of asking. We get afraid." "And if I say nothing?" he asked. "If I keep the picture in my pocket?" Rosa tilted her head. She had 2 daughters and a son who were the reasons she never missed a shift. "If you say nothing," she said, "nothing changes." The decision came at the end of a double shift, when the kitchen smelled like onion and warm metal and coffee grounds.
Mateo made his way to the back office, a narrow room with a leaning desk and a black phone that rarely rang, and he placed the photograph on the desk like a small, flat coin. He did not say, "This is evidence." He said, "This is what I saw." The manager looked up with the practiced calm of a man used to being watched. He thanked Mateo with a short nod, the kind of gratitude that is a transaction, recognition accepted and recorded. He did not make a show of it. He said, "Thank you. We'll look into it." What followed was a kind of corporate choreography Mateo did not know he had entered. The next day, a supervisor came with a clipboard and questions that sounded rehearsed. Dates, times, whether anyone else had been present. The supervisor used a gentle voice, as if this were a simple error to be corrected. He took the photo and asked to keep it for records. Mateo, who had never learned to argue with forms and protocols, said yes. They gave him a statement to sign, a paper that used the phrase, "breach of confidentiality," in a sentence that made his palms sweat. He left a copy of his statement in an envelope with the manager and returned to his station with a stomach that had emptied. 2 nights later, he was called into the office again. The tone had sharpened. The smile had thinned into something with edges. Luis, the manager, held the photograph between his fingers. "How did you get this?" his voice asked, though the question held, like everything else in that room, a choreography of power. There is a way a question can be a hand on someone's shoulder, soft but heavy. Mateo told the truth. He had seen the envelope, he said. He had taken the photo because he did not trust that a ledger would be enough if the pattern continued. He spoke simply, not as a man seeking drama, but as someone who had seen something and wanted it known. There was a stillness, a pressure, and then the manager spoke of rules. He cited policies Mateo had never read. He spoke of privacy and the proper channels. "We have procedures," Luis said. "We have a system." "They are the procedures we have," Mateo replied, "but people are losing things." The manager's face softened in a way that did not comfort. "We handle payroll through HR," he said. You shouldn't be taking photos of management. The word shouldn't in that context had the shape of a warning. On the third day, Mateo received a text. Pending investigation. You are suspended with pay for 3 days while we review personnel matters. The message read like an act of mercy. Suspended with pay was not the same as sent home without wages, but it removed him from the place where he had made his living and made his contribution visible in its mundaneness. He had bills that amounted to a week's worry. The photograph sat in his phone like an accusation and a shield at once. Word roofed through the kitchen like a temperature shift.
Some people closed up and left spaces between themselves and Mateo that had not been there before. Others approached with small gestures, a wrapped sandwich, a note folded into a tip envelope. "Stay strong," Rosa had written in uneven ink. The split in the staff was quiet and sharp, like a seam in a uniform that had finally come undone. Those who were closest to the manager drew nearer to him in a way that was not quite loyalty and not quite fear. They were aligning themselves with a person who had the authority to schedule and to reshape their incomes. Those who had, like Mateo, spent decades under fluorescent skies looked on with something between pity and anger. The photograph did not stay secret long. It is part of human nature to make visible to things someone else tries to hide. A young line cook, Alejandro, who carried his phone like a talisman and liked the idea of the truth being a small storm, asked to see the image when Mateo was suspended. He texted it to himself for safekeeping, a phrase that meant, in the digital age, that the image was already on the edge of a public moment. The first repost happened like a thread catching on a nail. A server who had once been cut from a shift shared it with a friend, who wrote a small caption about unfairness and missing tips. That friend posted it to a neighborhood group, where locals complained about late-night staffing and off-the-books pay. The post got a few likes, a curious comment. It spread to a community page devoted to workers' rights, and then to a local blogger who liked stories where the small man met a system that needed a shove. When the image found the blogger, it took a shape the way steam takes light. The blogger did not make a case of criminality. He posted a photo and asked, what happens when the people in charge take more than they should? He wrote a short piece about the erosion of dignity in low-wage service work and about the ways systems hide the subtraction of small amounts. He interviewed one of the cooks who had given him a tip about the ledger. He quoted an HR representative whose language had the smoothness of paperwork. The post got shared. People commented, "This is our neighborhood. I always wondered why the tip jar seemed empty. What protections do workers have?" The photo began to travel beyond the neighborhood page, across app after app, taking the quiet night kitchen and making it a public place. Mateo's face appeared, briefly, in a frame, and then a tag, invisible labor, and then a chorus of small, outraged replies. Things that are small on their own can become loud when amplified. Mateo found himself at the center of a conversation he did not start and could not easily leave. He received messages from strangers saying thank you, and saying they wish they had done the same. He received private messages accusing him of impropriety, of violating company policy, of being disloyal.
He received notes that didn't seem to know how to be gentle, people who expected his sacrifice to be simple and clean. He read them all in the dim of his kitchen at dawn, the way a person might read a ledger that had shifted suddenly to numbers that did not belong to them. His suspension ended after 3 days, but the hours he worked came back with a new weight. He was assigned earlier shifts as if to keep him visible under more oversight. The manager's smile had the same practiced calm, but there were meetings now with HR that required signatures and a sense that the workplace had been moved onto a stage. An internal memo appeared in the staff inbox, a bland corporate note about professional conduct and appropriate channels for reporting. The memo thanked the staff for their cooperation. It did not mention the photograph. The company issued a statement to the local blogger when he inquired, the kind of statement that lives in the space between care and corporate law, an assurance that the matter was under review, that the company took allegations seriously, and that it had implemented measures to ensure transparency. They apologized in the conditioned language of public relations for any employee concern. They did not, in public, articulate any fault. Inside the staff room, a piece of paper was pinned to the board, HR contact information. It suggested a roadmap that did not always feel accessible. As the image continued to make its rounds, a modest wave of solidarity gathered. A neighbor who ran a bakery down the block started a small GoFundMe without saying Mateo's name for a night shift worker facing hardship, and explained she wanted to help while the situation unfolded. The page raised enough in its first day to cover groceries and a rent payment. People who had once slipped $1 into a tip jar left notes of support in the margins of receipts. A local church offered a gift card. Mateo felt the weight of help like an unexpected warmth. It was not a solution to everything, but it was proof that visibility could also bring care. At the same time, the attention extracted other costs. There were days when servers avoided eye contact, as if proximity might be a stain.
There were managers who stood a little too near at roll call, their shadows lengthening in ways that felt like observation. Friends warned him that in these situations people could be moved out under the weight of administrative friction, sudden schedule changes, restructuring, performance reviews that found fault with things that had been tolerated before. He watched the ledger as if it were a living thing, flipping between pages for numbers and notes like he had become an investigator by profession. He worried not only for himself, but for those whose small wages would be easiest to trim when the company chose to rebalance. Mateo learned the vocabulary of caution. He found himself making photocopies of the photograph and the ledger entries when he could.
He sat with the small printout and folded it into protective creases, the way one might fold an extra napkin into a pocket. He guarded the physical fact because the digital life of the image had already slipped into spheres he could not control. Sometimes he thought of deleting it altogether. Sometimes he thought of printing it and pinning it on the staff board like a protest that read, "This stands for what happened." What altered him most was not the attention from strangers or the protective warmth of a fundraiser. It was the way he heard himself described by people who knew only the photograph. A patron posted a comment, "We owe them better." Another wrote, "Courage." The words stuck to Mateo like a label that did not feel as steady as the work itself. Courage is a loud thing. His life had been a series of small courages, showing up in freezing rain, holding a tray with hands numbed by cold, smiling when customers were tired. He felt ashamed of the label, as if an appellation for the public put him at a distance from the quiet calculation he had made at the back of the kitchen. Then, in the wake of initial posts and a short article, a local news team called the restaurant for comment. A camera showed up under a gray sky, and a reporter asked questions in a voice that wanted to be gentle. Cameras have a way of rearranging a scene to suit a narrative. They want a human face, and they want a conflict. Mateo mostly refused interviews. He had thought enough about being visible to know there were costs attached. But when a neighbor's GoFundMe raised more money than he had expected, and people began to show up at the cafe he had once imagined, people he did not know but who had sent messages about the dignity of work, he felt the tug of something new, a responsibility not only to himself, but to a broader conversation about workers. For every kind message, there were skeptical ones. "Why didn't you go to HR?" asked a commenter, as if all the steps in a system were equally safe to walk. Others accused the restaurant of being targeted unfairly, of being a small business under strain. The manager's defenders called for due process and suggested the photograph was being used to inflame a situation. These were arguments Mateo had not wanted to be a part of. They felt like bargaining chips laid on a table with stakes he could not count. Inside the staff room, the air held an awkwardness at first. Workers who had been close before now kept glances short. Rosa brought an extra sandwich and left it on the counter with a note. She did not ask for a statement. She simply slid it to him and said, "Keep your head." Alejandro, the young cook who had first texted the photograph for safekeeping, came by late and sat on the low stool without saying much. He bristled when someone called him reckless. "I thought it should be seen," he told Mateo, who only nodded.
A city council aide who read the blogger's post reached out to a neighborhood nonprofit that advocated for service workers. They wanted to know if Mateo would be willing to speak at a small community meeting. It was the only time he considered stepping up in public. He imagined a room where people could ask questions without interference, and where policies could be discussed that would make reporting safe and anonymous. He imagined, vaguely, because his mind liked to imagine things in small, practical numbers, a policy where somebody could report a pattern of missing tits without fear of instant human reprisal, a policy where audits were routine and not reactive. But between imagining and doing, there were more practical matters. Mateo's suspension had been paid, but the stress of being in the public eye had added hours to the nights he spent awake. He found himself counting the rent not as a number, but as a set of obligations. He called his daughter one night and heard her voice sink with worry when he explained that he had been sent home for a few days. "Is everything okay, Poppy?" she asked. He lied a little. He lightened it because he wanted to shield her nights. "There's a meeting," he said. "I'll be back soon." The photograph, meanwhile, did the work photographs often do. It simplified a moment into a picture that people could hold. On someone's phone screen, it was both proof and provocation. A hand, an envelope, a pocket. But context slipped on screens the way oil slips off ceramic. People who had never spent their nights in kitchens began to talk about systems and accountability. Patrons who had felt the pinch of a depleted tip jar began to wonder aloud if their dollars had been reaching those they intended.
The manager and the company, feeling the pressure of public attention, issued statements that promised an internal review and a commitment to fairness. They used language that was careful and shaped to avoid admission, and in that carefulness, Mateo saw both protection and evasion. He had not set out to be a lodestar. He had wanted a cafe, not confrontations. He had wanted to trade the percussive chorus of plates for a space where people could come inside and be warm. But his life had always been in conversation with other people's needs. He remembered how a cashier once lent him cash for a subway ride when his wallet had been held up in a drawer. He remembered a cook sharing a half plate of rice and beans because the day had been slow. There was a communal architecture to survival in these neighborhoods, a mutuality made of small, practical favors. The photograph had triggered something that resembled that mutuality on a larger scale. And yet, even as the public conversation grew, the immediate consequences for Mateo were narrow and personal. The manager called him into the office and spoke of professional expectations and the sanctity of privacy.
HR asked for more details: where the photo came from, who else had seen it, why he had not used anonymous channels. To them, his act was a data point. To him, it was a movement of conscience. The company placed him back on the schedule, but with shifts that changed each week. His paycheck would be the same, mostly, but the unpredictability became its own tax. By the time the first local article ran, headline modest, framed as "Workers Raise Concerns Over Missing Tips," Mateo had begun to understand the ambiguity of the moment. He received messages from candidates for local office offering support and asking for interviews. He was asked if he wanted to be part of a panel on worker rights. He felt like a door that had been opened into a long hallway he had never intended to traverse. Some doors open into libraries, some doors open into corridors lit by cameras and conflict. On a rainy morning, Mateo opened his notebook and drew the layout of his dreamed cafe again. He filled in the counter where the espresso machine would sit, the corner with mismatched chairs for night workers, a shelf with bus passes and a magnet board for lost mittens. He wrote numbers: the cost of a machine, the monthly rent, an estimate of nights saved by better wages. He wrote these things because plans are a refuge. They are how you remind yourself that not every turning is a descent. He held the photograph against the page and wondered which of the two worlds, the one of modest dreams and quiet labor, the other of public scrutiny and institutional accountability, would contain him at the end. The world around him was changing. A neighborhood blog picked up on the story and published the image with a caption that placed it in a wider pattern: a small city of invisible workers, a single lens, and a question of power. People commented with anecdotes, with empathy, with calls for reform. The manager faced the slow machinery of internal investigation. The company promised a review. The staff room began to host whispered meetings where workers traded rumors about audits and about whether the company might tighten its definition of private conduct to make future photographs a cause for termination. The climate of caution thickened like steam around a pot. Then someone did something Mateo did not expect. A regular diner, a woman who had always left a generous tip and who knew him by the way he tucked a napkin into a server's hand, posted the photo on her own account with a caption that read simply, "This is why we talk about dignity." Her followers, small but attentive, began to share. The image spread to a neighborhood feed that prided itself on advocacy. It was there that a local nonprofit that assisted service workers saw it and reached out. They wanted to know if Mateo would be willing to speak at their next meeting. They wanted to know if he needed legal advice, counseling, a safety plan.
They wanted to know how to help someone who had become visible in a way that left him exposed and vulnerable. He hesitated. The help felt good, but he did not want assistance that would tell his story for him. He wanted a process that respected his voice and his modest dignity. The nonprofit assured him they would convene a meeting where people could speak without fear of retaliation and where a lawyer could explain rights and options. They would include representatives from the company if he wished. They would include workers who had seen similar things. It sounded like a small, bureaucratic miracle, a space where conversation could be mediated away from the public square. Mateo agreed, with conditions. He would attend if his name was kept from any public material unless he consented. He would prefer an anonymous format where staff could speak indirectly, using forms that anonymized their accounts. He worried that the headline would become about him alone rather than the broader pattern. He wanted the conversation to be about systems rather than a single act of exposure. The nonprofit moved to accommodate these requests, drafting flyers that framed the meeting as a worker-led discussion. The day before the meeting, the manager called Mateo into his office again. "We want to resolve this," Louis said. His voice was calm and meticulously neutral. "We are proposing a mediation, confidential, no public statements. We believe this could be an opportunity to heal the team." He pushed a printed page across the desk and offered to sign an agreement that involved a conditional return to full hours and a clause about confidentiality regarding internal matters. Mateo looked at the page. The legal phrasing blurred for him. He thought of his daughter and the stalled purchases for the cafe and the way the ledger had looked when he had first found it. He thought of Rosa and Alejandro and those who would continue to work in a system that had not yet been restructured. Healing the team sounded lovely, like a bandage, but bandages do not repair the torn cloth of a system. He knew the offer carried a weight, stability in exchange for silence. He knew the shape of those trades. He had seen them before in the tiny resignations his co-workers made to keep their hours. Mateo left the office with the paper folded in his jacket. He went to the back alley and leaned against the brick where the rain had been thin earlier and sipped a coffee someone had given him. He took out the photo again and looked at it. The image had not changed. The envelope remained folded into a pocket, the hand a half gesture that could be read in many ways. He felt the pull of two directions, the peaceful one, that your life might return to its quiet center if you signed, and the stubborn one, that said a system that could not be asked to repair itself might never be fixed by silence. He called his sister and told her everything in a voice that was small.
She listened like someone equipped with a steady patience and then said, "Mateo, you have to decide what keeps your dignity." It was not a question of adrenaline. It was a question about the arithmetic of survival and the ethics of speech. When he went to the small community meeting convened by the nonprofit, the room smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. People had gathered, bakers, baristas, a teacher who had once worked the register, an older man with a collection of closings from his own life. They introduced themselves in the way people do when they want to create a safe circle: first names, professions, one sentence about why they were there. Mateo sat in the back, his hands folded, the photograph lying face down in his jacket. When the facilitator asked if anyone wanted to speak, a dozen hands rose by rhythm. This was the friction where the public became personal, where policy met the lives it was supposed to regulate. A woman who had worked in the service industry for 30 years told a story about missing wages and the time when her tips did not match the clocked hours. A young man spoke about the fear of losing his shift because his manager did not like when he asked to trade with someone. The nonprofit took notes and promised to speak to local policymakers about anonymous reporting mechanisms, about audits, about worker education. The conversation was not immediate power, it was a kind of patient pressure. Mateo listened and realized that the photograph had become a seed for a different conversation than the one the manager had offered him in the office. Not a mediation to sew a tear in cloth with tape, but a longer mending of the weave itself. He did not yet know which path he would take. The manager's offer still sat like a potential harbor. The nonprofit's promise of longer-term advocacy felt like a map. He had to choose whether to accept a quick stability or to remain a living example of a problem that needed public pressure. He felt the weight of that decision in his chest like a stone. He thought of his daughter's smile and of the small storefront layout he had drawn a dozen times. He thought of the possibility of a cafe that could, in its small way, be a repair for people like him. At home that night, he spread the photograph on his kitchen table and looked at it under the lamplight. He traced the outline of the envelope with his fingertip. The moment of taking that picture had been quiet and practical. It had not been born of a plan for notoriety. Now it had escaped him and become something larger. He could taste in his mouth the metallic note of fear and the sweet, thin tang of support. He was not ready to make the final public decision. He slept badly and woke with the feeling of someone who had been read aloud to, a story told in a language he had not chosen. He kept the photograph safe, and for the first time in a long while, reached for the notebook where he had scrawled the cafe plan.
He began to write, beside the numbers, a list of possible steps. Petition HR for anonymous reporting. Coordinate with a nonprofit to draft a one-page guide for workers. Save the GoFundMe for a small down payment. The list offered a structure he could hold. Before the meeting with HR that would come the following week, before a possible public hearing the nonprofit suggested, someone outside the place where he worked made a choice that changed the shape of the moment. A patron who had been quietly following the posts printed a copy of the photo and took it to a neighborhood blog's open mic night. He held it up and told a short story about the invisible labor that kept the city going. The hands that washed dishes, the ones that sterilized coffee machines at dawn, the ones that mended a seam in a uniform. The audience listened. A writer in the crowd, used to thinking about systems and sympathy, tweeted an image of the printed photograph with a note about dignity and accountability. That small tweet found the attention of a local journalist who had been following worker stories. Within 48 hours, the photograph,
once folded into Mateo's private ledger, had become an object in a public conversation that could not easily be folded back into silence. Mateo sat at his kitchen table and watched the small, steady snow of notifications on his phone. Each ping was an ember of attention, some warm, some sharp. He had wanted to be invisible in a world that rarely noticed those who performed its smallest labors. Now he was visible in a way that brought both warmth and exposure. He realized in a quiet, honest way that the photograph had not only exposed a possible wrong, it had also opened a question about what it costs to be seen. He folded his hands over the photograph like one might cover a small flame. He could feel in his chest the possibility of many outcomes. He could accept the manager's confidential mediation and keep his life narrow and secure. He could stand with the nonprofit and press for policy change that might take months and might, in the end, do little for his immediate needs. He could step into the public and speak, risking his privacy for the sake of others. Each option carried a price. Outside, the night gathered and the air cooled. The dish sinks were quieter than they had been weeks before. The world had rearranged. The world had rearranged itself around him, like a kitchen that had been shifted on its casters. The same counters, different angles. Mateo folded the photograph back into his jacket and stood for a moment on the curb with the rain soft on his shoulders. He had not chosen notoriety, but now he was learning how to live inside it. If this is reaching you, tell me where you're watching from. Leave a comment. It matters to see the map of who listens. He decided, quietly and with a patience that had been practiced in Dishwasher, to refuse the mediation.
The paper smelled of office ink and closed hands. It promised a harbor on the condition of silence. Mateo could feel what the silence would do, the way it would stitch over the missing stitches, while the whole widened in small increments. He told Luis he appreciated the company's offer of mediation, but he wanted the nonprofit present, and he wanted anonymized forms at the meeting. He asked for a written commitment to consider anonymous reporting and regular audits of tip reporting. He did not know if he would get all he asked for. He only knew he could not sign away the possibility of a systemic change for a week of quiet. The nonprofit moved like a coalition of people who knew how to turn small pressure into public leverage. They arranged an advisory meeting with a legal volunteer, a workers' rights advocate, and a representative from a council member's office who specialized in small business labor concerns. They also prepared a simple one-page guide about options for workers who witness irregularities, who to contact, what evidence to keep, and how to document interactions without endangering shifts. The language was practical, not heroic. It addressed bus passes and rent checks as much as ethics. Mateo liked that. The company's response was cautious. There were more memos, this time with the serif font of formality, announcing that an external audit of tip handling and payroll procedures would begin to ensure continued fairness. They appointed a liaison to be present at the nonprofit meeting. To some staff, this looked like progress. To others, it looked like a pause button pressed by a public relations team until the noise went away. Mateo heard both interpretations and knew that public attention had bought time. Whether that time would be used to rearrange systems or to paper over them with better rhetoric remained open. At the community meeting, the room filled with the small, practical people who made neighborhoods run, bakers who rose before dawn, a transit worker with grease permanently under his thumbnail, a grad student who organized campus workers, and a nurse who worked the night clinic. They sat around folding tables and warmed their hands on paper cups. Mateo's hands were steady as he spoke. He read nothing from a paper. He told the simple chronology, the ledger found behind the aprons, the envelope tucked into the manager's pocket, the photograph taken as a record, the offer of mediation that asked for silence. He did not ask anyone to call the manager a thief. He asked them to imagine a workplace where small subtractions did not happen in corners. When he finished, the room hummed, not the abrupt roar of a rally, but the slow, considerate murmur of people figuring out how to help.
The nonprofit volunteered to coordinate a small audit with an independent mediator. The council member's aide promised to look into local policies around anonymous reporting and small business accountability. A retired bookkeeper offered to help staff understand payroll statements. A few people offered immediate practical aid. A baker who would deliver a tray of empanadas to those working late. A teacher who would help Mateo's daughter with after-school math for free. The meeting was not a verdict. It was a slow stitching of social fabric. In the days that followed, the audit commenced in the quiet way of paperwork being moved across desks and clocks being checked. External auditors came in with clipboards and an economy of questions. They asked about tip jars, cash reconciliation, where ledgers were stored, and how payroll was logged. The company made a public comment that it welcomed the review and that it was committed to a respectful workplace. The nuance of welcomed and committed felt like a careful work of tone management, but the presence of an outside audit meant that procedures would be examined by people who did not have their livelihoods tied to one manager's word. For Mateo,
Public attention remained a double-edged blade. He received invitations to speak at radio stations, emails from local organizers asking him to share his story, and private messages from workers in other cities telling him his photograph had made them look at their own pay stubs. He also received a flurry of skeptical comments, some accusing him of grandstanding, others implying he had broken trust. He learned to fold his attention away from the noise and to keep his focus on the concrete: rent, his daughter's school fees, the espresso machine price written in his notebook. On a gray Thursday, the audit produced a report that was careful in its language. Irregularities in handling of tip envelopes and minor inconsistencies in ledger reconciliation were observed, and then, importantly, a set of recommendations. Among them, instituting an anonymous reporting tool, a secure box, and a digital form managed by an independent third party, mandatory training sessions on payroll and tip reporting, routine audits every quarter, and the posting of clear payroll and tip policy documents in the staff room. The auditors did not use the word corruption. They used irregularities and recommendations. For Mateo, the effect of being careful in word was less important than the way the company acted on it. Action happened unevenly. The company implemented some of the recommendations quickly. A clear payroll policy was printed and posted. HR offered training sessions that staff could attend during paid time, and an anonymous reporting form was set up through a third-party service. These were small victories and palpable improvements for some. For others, the schedule churn and lingering suspicion did not vanish with a poster on the break room wall.
The manager, Luis, was repositioned. The company said, in its public comment, that personnel changes had been made to ensure confidence in management practices. For Mateo, the phrase framed a personnel shift as a neutral administrative step. Behind the phrasing, staff noticed that the manager was no longer managing the night shift. He moved to a different location within the company, or perhaps he took an unexpected leave, depending on who told the story. The nonprofit, careful with language as well, called this an administrative decision that followed from the audit's recommendations. Mateo did not celebrate with bell ringing. The removal felt less cathartic than it might have in a storybook. It was a paper rearrangement that might offer relief, but did not by itself stitch all wounds. Crowdfunding had done a small, practical thing for Mateo. The GoFundMe had raised more than a rent payment. It had covered the week's groceries, a repair for his daughter's school shoes, and a portion of a down payment for the espresso machine he envisioned. He used the money with care. He rented a small storage space for his espresso machine parts rather than signing a lease right away. He paid for a technical inspection of a refurbished grinder. He also used a portion of the funds to seed a small local fund to help other workers who might face temporary hardship because they spoke up, an informal mutual aid jar managed through the nonprofit. That mutual aid fund became a small experiment in solidarity. It operated with an application form that was intentionally light: MAME, brief description of need, proof of employment in the neighborhood, and a statement promising to pay forward if circumstances allowed. Mateo sat with the nonprofit organizers the first week to review requests. He found himself in the unlikely role of gatekeeper and helper at once, deciding whether a person who needed bus fare or a temporary deposit could receive help. These moments etched new muscles of responsibility in him. He had protested for others, and now he had become part of the scaffolding that might catch them. The kitchen returned to shifts that were familiar and yet altered. Servers and cooks filed by him as they always had, but there were new conversations under the hum of the fluorescent lights. A server asking a manager about tip pooling mechanisms, a line cook asking HR on the training day about payroll codes. Rosa, still steady as ever, brought extra empanadas and left them on the prep table with notes, for whoever needs warmth. Alejandro, who had texted the photograph in a moment of impulsive clarity, began to sign up for the worker training sessions and would later help Mateo install the simple digital form on a tablet in the break room. Mateo's dream of the little cafe turned from a scribble in a notebook to a plan with timelines. He found a small storefront in a strip of affordable spaces, a room with a dented metal door and a skylight that had once housed a tailor.
It needed work. The plumbing required attention, and a permit had to be filed. He spent long afternoons with a contractor learning about ventilation and health inspection checklists. The nonprofit connected him with someone who taught small business bookkeeping in exchange for an inexpensive espresso and a sincere promise to hire at least one night shift worker when the time came. Opening a cafe was not a miraculous reversal. It involved permits, inspections, supply orders, and a lot of paperwork that frequently felt like a test of patience. There were nights he would come home exhausted and tally the cost of a cafe's cupboards. There were also nights he would receive an envelope with a note. "We believe in this." A neighbor who ran a hardware store donated a set of mismatched chairs. Rosa volunteered to teach him a recipe for empanadas that would travel well in steam boxes. The ledger of community gifts grew in small increments. As he worked, he kept the photograph against the page of his notebook, no longer a weapon or a secret, but a reminder of a choice. He slowly began to accept interviews, but only when he felt they would help the cause. A local radio show that aimed to highlight labor stories, a short panel organized by the nonprofit about workplace safety and accountability. He refused larger, more sensational outlets because they wanted moments honed into a spectacle. Mateo preferred to speak in the plain, precise sentences of someone who wanted to keep the conversation about systems, not him. There were setbacks. The company underwent a shift in regional management. The new regional director had a different vocabulary for dealing with public scrutiny and initially slowed some implementations. A small committee like the nonprofit could nudge and cajole, but could not force a national corporation into sudden reform. There were also moments of betrayal. Someone who had once slipped him a sandwich and a smile stopped answering his texts. There were nights when the payroll came and a missed overtime suddenly appeared as adjustment, requiring more questions. These were the tiny, nagging difficulties that make long fights feel exhausting. Through it all, the cafe plan remained an anchor. He scoured used equipment listings and made friends with a man who refurbished grinders in his garage. He counted out the cost of a single bar stool and felt the arithmetic of hope. The funds from the mutual aid campaign were not enough to cover everything, but they were enough to make a start. He took out a modest loan with the nonprofit's help, on terms that were explained plainly, and signed what he could afford. The night the cafe opened, Mateo stood behind a counter that smelled of hot milk and faint cinnamon. The space was small and mismatched. Second-hand chairs, a chalkboard with the day's empanadas written in a wobbly hand, a jar labeled "Tips for Folks Who Need a Hand."
He had hired 3 people: Rosa, who worked mornings and taught empanadas, Alejandro, who came in for the late-night shifts and busied himself with music playlists he thought fit the cafe's hours, and a young woman named Yara, who had been out of work for a month and needed a second chance. They all had histories with the night kitchens and the rhythms of service. On opening night, a small line formed. People who had followed the story came in: bakers, the transit worker, the nonprofit organizer, and some neighbors who wanted to support. The menu was simple: coffee, empanadas, and respect. Mateo made a point of serving free meals to night shift workers who showed an ID for a while. He kept the jar of "Tips for When Times Are Thin" next to the register, and sometimes he put a small sign on the door: "Night workers eat here." The cafe became a place of repair, not in the sense of miraculous fix, but in the modest, daily way of offering warmth, a place to leave a note, and a board with local resources. The wall near the door displayed a laminated page with HR contact information, printed payroll policies, and a list of local nonprofits offering legal aid or counseling. It was not an end to systemic problems, but it was a small map of help. At the restaurant where he had once worked, things settled into a new rhythm. The audit process continued with periodic checks. The anonymous reporting mechanism caught a few reports, some petty, some serious, and HR had to respond with follow-ups and sometimes training refreshers. The management expressed that changes were intended to prevent the erosion of trust, a phrase that meant little or a lot depending on whom you asked. Some staff felt safer, others remained cautious. The culture shifted in small ways. Ledgers were kept in a locked cabinet, tip jars were reconciled in front of employees, and HR held an open office hour once a week to answer questions. Mateo did not become an untouchable hero. He still did the small, steady acts that had defined him: arriving early, wiping the counters, listening when someone needed to speak. He was recognized in the neighborhood, and people often asked him how it felt to be the person who stood up. He would answer simply: it was a thing he had done because he could not let small injustices become routine. The photograph had been a catalyst. The real work was remaking habits and systems so that what had happened would be less likely to happen again. There were quiet moments of reconciliation, too. One evening, as the cafe was about to close, a former colleague from the restaurant came in, nervous, hat in hands. He bought a coffee and sat for a long time. He apologized for staying away during the most intense months. He said he had been afraid for his hours and his family. He had been watching the training videos and learning to understand how to read a payroll stub.
He asked if Mateo could help him fill out the anonymous reporting form when he needed to bring a small concern. Mateo handed him a napkin and wrote the nonprofit's number on it. There was no great embrace, only 2 people aligning themselves through small, careful acts. Months later, the City Council held a hearing about small business accountability and worker protections. The nonprofit organized speakers, and a representative read the auditor's recommendations into the record. Mateo attended but did not take the microphone. Instead, he sat among others who had practical fixes to propose: simple reporting tools, small grants to help workers who missed pay because of investigations, and mandatory training for managers that included listening skills for disputes. These were modest proposals, yet they were the sort of proposals that, if implemented, could change the arithmetic of risk for a worker like Mateo. The hearing did not end in sweeping legislation. It ended in a commitment to a pilot program in a few neighborhoods to test anonymous reporting and create a small fund to assist workers temporarily displaced during disputes. The council member's office called it a measured approach. It was not the radical transformation some demanded, but it was more than a press release. For Mateo, it returned the fight into the field of policy, where processes could be improved incrementally. At the cafe, months after the opening, Mateo hung a small plaque in the staff bathroom. It read, in careful, modest letters, "This space acknowledges the dignity of all who work in our city. If you see an irregularity, please use the anonymous reporting form at the counter." He also kept a small book behind the register, a ledger of community stories, notes left by customers about kindnesses received, by workers thanking the cafe for a meal, by neighbors asking for help finding resources. The book was not an archive of heroism. It was a record of the small, steady exchanges that made a neighborhood live. Once, a woman sat at the bar and asked to see the photograph that had first started it all. Mateo hesitated, then retrieved a soft copy printed on plain paper. He did not hide the image. He explained why he had taken it as a measure to keep a record for the safety of coworkers. He showed her the photocopy of the ledger and pointed out the gaps that had once been there. The woman listened and then left a tip with a note: "For those who keep watch." It was the kind of small moral economy the cafe practiced, gestures that cost little and meant much. Mateo kept mentoring. He helped Yara apply for a part-time certificate course, and he gave Alejandro a small stack of books about small business practice that had helped him plan. Rosa taught staff how to make empanadas quickly and with care, and sometimes she would press a warm one into Mateo's hand as he closed up, as if to say, "You did a good thing. Keep making warm places." There were anniversaries in small acts.
The nonprofit organized a modest celebration 1 year after the photo had been made public. They invited workers from different restaurants to sit in a circle and share things that had improved: clearer payroll notices, anonymous reporting that had been used to flag scheduling injustices, and a small mutual aid fund to cover immediate needs. Mateo spoke briefly, not about himself, but about the way small acts accumulate. Visibility, he said, was not a trophy. It was the chance to fix a leak. He described the cafe not as a monument, but as a workspace where people could find a warm cup and a bulletin board with real resources. Time softened some tensions. There were fewer furtive glances in the staff room. The anonymous form caught a complaint about someone taking cash that was swiftly resolved and led to a short suspension followed by mediation. The reporter closed the case with a checklist and, importantly, a clear policy update announced to staff. For many workers, these practical changes were relief. For others, suspicion lingered like a smell that could not be scrubbed out. Mateo never pretended the world had been cured. He only admitted that small mechanisms were now in place that might make future choices less fraught. The boss's fate was never a headline about guilt. It was a personnel decision communicated in the language of business practice. The company announced they had made a personnel realignment after the audit, and it appointed new management practices across the chain. The language was careful because institutions often move in careful language. The community accepted it with the same pragmatic tempering. What mattered to Mateo and many of his colleagues was not a moral verdict, but a systemic change that meant fewer corners and more light. Years later, the cafe had a bulletin board that was always full, flyers for ESL classes, a tutoring schedule for Mateo's daughter, and a note from a council aide announcing a small worker protection workshop. The little jar labeled "Tips for When Times Go Thin" was refilled more intentionally by customers who had come to understand its purpose. Mateo would wipe the counter and think of the first photograph tucked into his jacket, no longer a secret, but a marker in the stream of cause and effect. He still sometimes woke at night thinking about the ledger behind the aprons. He thought about Luis and the difficult choices that sometimes pushed people into corners. He did not embrace a caricature of villainy. Power is complicated, he had learned. So is fear. He had met coworkers who protected a manager because they feared what would happen if they did not. He had met managers who had made bad choices, and in other cases who had tried to do their jobs well in the pressures of small business margins. The work was to make structures that made bad choices harder and good choices easier. A year after the cafe opened, a small ceremony was held in the back room.
The nonprofit, the council member's office, and a handful of neighbors gathered. A modest plaque was presented to the cafe in recognition of its community work, for creating space for night workers and for advancing small steps toward fair practices. Mateo accepted the plaque with a steadiness that surprised him.
He put it on a shelf, next to a faded family photo, his daughter's crooked grin still there, and a small printout of the auditor's recommendations. The plaque did not erase the months of strain or the costs he had endured, but it marked something durable, a garden planted in a patch of cracked concrete. In quiet moments, he would sit at a table near the window and watch the night shift workers come in after long hours. A woman from the hospital would come for a soup, a janitor would come for strong coffee, students would come for pastries and warmth. They would leave notes on the board asking about training or offering their own skills. Mateo would sometimes think about how small structures, an anonymous reporting form, a posted payroll policy, a jar for emergency funds, had added up to a different fabric of neighborhood life. The photograph remained as much a part of his history as the ledger he'd found. He had, in time, printed it and placed a copy in a folder at the nonprofit's office for safekeeping. He understood that photographs were not always neat verdicts. They were catalysts and records, and sometimes the only thing that made a routine injustice visible enough to address. When his daughter came to the cafe for a school project, she pressed a drawing into his hand, a picture of the storefront with a sun above it and people lined up. He pinned it to the wall behind the register. She had learned, in the way children do, that her father had acted when he had seen something wrong. She did not have the full language of risk and policy. She had simply pride. Mateo did not imagine the future as a wide, triumphant arc. He had learned the modest work of repair, that systems must be nudged, that community tends to be uneven, and that courage is often a quiet, prolonged endurance. He kept his notebook, and on nights when he was slow, he would sketch new ideas, a small scholarship fund for workers' children, a rotating list of neighbors who could deliver a meal, a small library of books about running a cafe. Each idea was practical and small-minded. That was the point. In the end, the photograph had done what a single record sometimes can. It introduced visibility into a place where things were hidden by habit. It did not solve everything. It did not make the world suddenly fair. It created a set of conditions under which people could begin to argue for fairness without having to risk everything in a single shout. The cafe continued, with its mismatched chairs and an espresso machine that hummed like a steady heart. Mateo stood behind the counter, sometimes wiping a plate with a cloth that had become softer with use.
People came and went. The plaque he had received hung not as a monument, but as a reminder. Small actions can redirect the course of things if they are followed by patient, communal work. And in the staff room of the restaurant, where that ledger had once hidden its page, there was now a small folder labeled Payroll and Reporting. It contained a clear set of instructions, a number for the third-party reporting tool, and a list of times HR would hold office hours. It would not fix everything, but it reduced the number of dark places where small things could be taken. Mateo folded his hands over his notebook and for a moment allowed himself something like relief. He thought of the first time he pressed the photograph into the light, of the 2 seconds between seeing and deciding. He did not imagine himself as an invisible hero. He was a man who had done what he thought a decent person must do when confronted with a steady, small theft of dignity. That decision carried costs. It also carried the possibility of a different arrangement, one where the small labors of many were less likely to be subtracted in corners. He kept the family photograph in his wallet, the one his daughter had used in a school project. He kept the printed image of the ledger in a folder at the nonprofit. He kept the memory in the way people keep recipes, not as a trophy, but as an instruction about what to do when you see something in the kitchen. Production note: this is a dramatized account inspired by the emotional and narrative DNA of multiple voices and events. Characters, organizations, and outcomes have been fictionalized to respect privacy and to focus on the ethical themes of visibility, community response, and modest institutional reform. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in dignity at work.